the truth is, when it comes to supplies for drawing, absolutely anything will work. There are some specific supplies out there that are really helpful, and we're going to go over them now. But know that um, even if all you have is a number 2 pencil or a ballpoint pen, notebook paper or copy paper, you can still draw and have a very successful drawing. I know that there are so many supplies out there, and sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming trying to pick that quote unquote right pencil or paper. So I wanted to spend a little time to start off just talking about the different types of paper that are out there and how to find the right paper for drawing. There are a couple things that we can look for. I know that there are some high quality paper out there that's really great to use, but the truth is any paper will work for drawing. Like I mentioned earlier, any paper will work. I will say when I do commission work or when I do work that is going to be hanging in an exhibition, I will spend a little extra money and get that expensive, the nicer paper because it's archival paper and it's supposed to last longer and all that. But for most of the drawing that I do, just a regular sketchbook that you can find almost anywhere will work. If you've been into like a big box store like Walmart or Target, or if you've been in an art supply store like Hobby Lobby or Blick or Michaels, you'll see there are a variety of papers there. Typically, the best type of paper for drawing is going to be something labeled sketch paper or drawing paper. And these, what makes them like the best for drawing is that they have a smooth surface. And so if you have a sketchbook or a drawing book and you can feel that paper, you'll see it's kind of thin and it's got a smooth surface. And that's going to be the best drawing paper, especially if we're using tools like pencils, like graphite. One of the things you'll want to look for when it comes to paper is on every type of paper we purchase, there's a poundage. And so when you're looking at sketch paper, drawing paper, that poundage is going to be kind of around 68 or 70. And that also kind of clues us in on the thickness of the paper. For example, copy paper is around 60, 65 pounds. We know that's really thin. Sketchbook paper is a little thicker. That's that 68 or 70 pound. When we get to other paper, you'll see, I have an example here. This is sketch paper, but if we look at the poundage, it says 96 pounds. 96, 98 is what you're going to get. It's a little thicker. And that's typically something for like mixed media or pastels, pen and ink. That thicker poundage is helpful for that. If you're doing something like watercolor, the poundage you'll generally see are 140 pound, and that's a really thick paper. The thicker the pound, like the higher the number per poundage, the more supplies you can use with it. So with that 140 pound or that 98, 96 pound, you can use a lot of supplies. Like I said, you can use markers, you can use paint pens, you can use watercolor, you can bring in pastels. It can hold up better than the thinner paper that we use for sketching. And there are some really great brands out there too. So typically when you're buying sketchbooks, you'll see brands like Canson or Strathmore, Arches. Those are really good quality ones. You can also, like I said, the cheaper stuff too works really well. Most of what I use is like that cheap paper that you find at, like, I've even used Dollar Tree paper often for sketching. It doesn't have to be that higher quality stuff. Any paper really does work. So whatever paper you have with you, you will still have a good drawing on it. There are a couple different types of bindings, I guess, that are really good for drawing. One is the spiral. That's probably my favorite to use, and it's because it has the perforated parts. So if I want to tear my paper out, I can have a nice clean edge. You can also have, this is the sketchbook that I carry around with me all the time, but you can have like this hardbound book too. The difference though is that it doesn't have those perforated edges, so it's a little harder to take out. So if you have this hard binding here, it's good, but it just means that those pages will stay in the book, which again is why I like doing the spiral bound, because it has those perforated edges that I can tear out. All right, let's talk a little bit about pencils. So pencils, there are basically 3 types. You can get hard, medium, and soft. So pencils are basically made of a mixture of clay and graphite, right? And so it's called lead. That's the centerpiece of it, right? But uh, how the amount of clay and graphite in the lead really determines how hard or soft that pencil is. And so if you get a set of pencils, if you've seen a set of pencils before, you'll see that there's some H's, there's some B's, you may see an F. The H, when you get your pencil set, an H is a lighter value. And we'll talk more about the value scale in a moment. But an H is a lighter value. It has less graphite. The B's, they have a darker value. You're going to get a bolder color. And it's because they have more graphite in it. So that kind of helps us, thinking about that kind of helps us with our value scale when it comes to using those pencils. Now, graphite pencils, if you go to the store, you can see graphite pencils generally range from like a 9B, which is the softest and the darkest, to like a 9H, which is the hardest and the lightest. And so you can see generally when you buy pencils in a pack, 6B will be that darkest, and usually around 4H or 6H will be the lightest, but you'll generally get kind of a scale that way. One of the things I do want to mention is if you have like a number 2 pencil, if that's the only pencil that you have, number 2 pencils have the same amount of graphite as an HB pencil. It's kind of in the center. It'll show it on the pencil, but if it doesn't, it's still HB. That number 2 is an HB pencil. So that kind of lets you know that little bit, a little bit of what that graphite looks like. The higher the number, the higher it is on that hard or soft scale. So 6B is going to be the darkest. That 6H is going to be that lightest. And so HB is going to be kind of in the middle. And sometimes you'll see an F in there. And an F really is that fine line. It's for like fine line drawings. I don't use F a lot, but I know some people do. When you're doing some drawings, typically you want a hard, a medium, and a soft. And so kind of my go-to for a hard pencil when I'm doing drawings is a 2H or an HB. When I'm doing kind of that middle medium color, I usually stick with like a 2B. And when I do the soft color, or not the soft, the bolder colors, the darker colors, I'll usually stick with like a 6B. And so just to kind of show that difference here, I'm going to pull those pencils out so we can see it. A lot of learning how to draw is really kind of playing with it and exploring with it. We find our supplies that work the best for us, but it's good to know what they feel like and what they can do. So I talked about having that hard pencil when we're doing the drawings for that lighter value. And so I have a 2H here that I'm just going to kind of make a mark with, and the HB. And hopefully you can see the difference in just those two, right? That the higher the number, that 2H, the lighter it's going to be, right? If we go to that middle tone, that like 2B, you can see it's already getting darker. So the higher we get on the B scale, the darker it's going to be. Right? And so the 6B, you can see I use that one a lot. That's my shortest. The 6B, you can see is even darker. So we can kind of see that difference. So if you have a set of pencils, go ahead and play with that a little bit and see the different values each of those pencils have. So when you're doing a drawing, you can use just one pencil, right? Often when I'm doing drawings, I'll use like my regular drafting pencil, nothing fancy. And you can get a variety of value from that one pencil, but it is helpful to have those different pencils because it's an easier way to get that value change. One of the things that's coming up is like those who are left-handed, and that's true. I am right-hand dominant, but I have learned over the years when it comes to drawing, that sometimes it's not always the best to be just right-handed, because you get smearing that way, or left-handed, you get smearing that way. And so a lot of times when it comes to drawing, I've kind of over the years practiced using both hands, just to make it easier for me to draw and kind of work around the spirals or the binding. And so like smearing is one thing that happens. I will share too, one of the tricks that I've learned when it comes to not smudging while you're drawing is sometimes it's helpful when you're drawing to have an extra piece of paper there that you can press on top so you're not getting that smudge on your hand, and that kind of prevents that. So you can move that paper as you're doing your drawing and it won't smear like that. Let's talk about sharpeners too. One of the things that I've learned as well when it comes to pencil sharpening is typically when we sharpen our pencil, like I'm right hand dominant, so I'll generally hold the sharpener, or not the sharpener, the pencil in my right hand and do the twisting with my right hand. But when it comes to like drawing pencils or even colored pencils, I've found that it's better for the pencil to hold the sharpener in your dominant hand and you spin that sharpener around holding that pencil. Really any handheld one works well. It doesn't have to be anything specifically. I do want to mention erasers too. When it comes to drawing with graphite, there are two types of erasers that can be really nice to work with. There's a kneaded eraser and a soft eraser. I use the soft eraser probably more than the kneaded eraser, and a lot of that is because I don't like the way the kneaded eraser feels in my hand. But the kneaded eraser is nice to work with. I'll show the kneaded eraser here. It's typically gray. And when you pull it out of its package, it's something you can bend and manipulate. You can push it on itself. The nice thing about the kneaded eraser is that you can push it to a point. So if you want like a fine mark, you can kind of erase it that way. The soft eraser does that as well, but once you start using it, it kind of dulls the edges a little bit, so you no longer get the sharp edges. But this is also a really great one to use for erasing graphite. I'll share one of the ones that I use often is this triangle eraser, and it's because it has 3 sharp edges, so I can get really fine lines when I do erasing. And it's always sharp. And again, like it really depends on what feels right in your hand. Like I said, I don't use the kneaded eraser because it just feels weird to me, but it is helpful. Some people find the kneaded eraser is the best eraser to use when working with graphite. And the last thing I want to mention when it comes to supplies is a stump. It's also called a tortillon, but it's a wrapped paper that you can use for blending. And so you can see here, when I use that stump, it kind of blends that out a little bit. You don't have to use the stump. You can use other things like a Q-tip. Sometimes I'll use my finger. The downside to using your finger to do the blending is that the natural oils that we have in our hands sometimes affect the integrity of the graphite or the paper. I like the way it feels, so I always use my fingers, but that stump is really handy as well. And you'll find that when you go shopping for drawing supplies, you'll see that stump there too. Now, I know I mentioned earlier about how the root of drawing is all about observation. And so I want to kind of go back to that. There was one that focused on shapes and forms. And here's the thing that these shapes here, the circle, the square, the triangle, this is basically the root of everything, that basic form. Everything that we see boils down to these 3 shapes, right? And so once we start seeing those 3 shapes in everyday objects or landscapes or whatever it is, it makes it a little easier to start the drawing process. So finding those basic shapes. So for example, my sketchbook here, if we look at that, that basic shape is a square, right? That's kind of easy to see when it's a square book. But what if we look at something like a pair of scissors? That basic shape is going to be that triangle. Once we see that basic shape, It makes it a little easier when it comes to starting that drawing process, right? Once we see that triangle shape, we can start filling in those details. But looking for that basic shape helps us set up that drawing, right? And so even a pair of scissors, even though it looks like it has a lot of shapes within it, seeing that basic shape is a really good starting place. Now, what if it's something that's a little more detailed? Let's look at my hand, for example. We're looking at my hand. That basic shape that we find is going to be a bunch of squares, right? Starting with that palm, that's a square. Seeing where our fingers are, that's that square shape. And even those different segments within our finger are the squares. So once I start seeing that basic shape within these objects, it makes it easier to set up those drawings. So I want to encourage you to take a moment and just look around your space right now and notice the shapes around you. Like I said, when it comes to drawing, it really is all about observing. And so maybe you have a coffee cup next to you. Maybe you have a notebook or a ruler, or, whatever it is around you. Take a moment right now to look for those basic shapes, that square, that triangle, that circle. That's that 2D shape. And that's kind of the starting place when it comes to drawing. Now, once we start building that drawing out, we're going to go into those different forms. We'll see those basic shapes kind of go into those forms. The basic shape of a circle, when we build that form around it, draw that form around it, it becomes a sphere. For that square, right, it becomes a cube. The triangle, we get the cone or the pyramid when we start going into that 3D shape. But again, all those shapes, all those objects we're looking at, all those images, it boils down to those three basic shapes. I have my cup. It's this cylinder shape. So when I start looking at building this shape out, I'll notice that circle, that rectangle, that circle. It's not this flat image, but those basic shapes are building out this image for me. So when I start noticing those shapes, I can start constructing my image. Next, with the drawing words and definitions. What's important are not the words themselves, it's what those words kind of stand for, the idea behind them. And we'll kind of go over that, like I said, throughout the series. But what I want us to kind of talk about today are some shading techniques. And these are some really great basic shading techniques. One of my favorite artists, her name is CJ Hendry. She is an illustrator. She does a lot of drawings. All of her work is made with colored pencils. And her technique, she does these hyper realist drawings. And her technique is this scribble technique. So I want us, if you have your pencil and have some paper handy, go ahead and we're going to try out some of these different shading techniques. So I'm going to use just a number 2 pencil, that kind of medium pencil. And that first one we're going to kind of look at is that scribble. Now, the benefit of doing scribble shading is that it makes it easier to layer colors. So for example, if you're using colored pencil, doing that scribble technique is easy to kind of build off of. And really that scribble technique is just doing a whole bunch of scribbles, really just a whole bunch of circles. It helps shade things in, right? And it's just one way to do that kind of shading. Mm. Another shading technique that's really helpful is hatching. And so hatching is very simply a bunch of lines. So it's lines going the same direction. And so this right here is hatching. It helps kind of shade in spaces, right? Doing that hatching. Another hatching technique is called cross hatching. So it's cross hatching. And that's basically starting with that hatching, going that one way, and then crossing it and going that other way. A lot of times when people use hatching, they'll use that cross hatching to get that darker value when it comes to shading in an object. Shading technique is going to be dots, which of course is self-explanatory, I guess. It's a whole bunch of dots that you're making. And dots is one that I found is harder for my hand. I have some strength issues in my hand, and so doing the dots tends to be a very detail specific one. And so it's one that's a little harder for me to do, but it's all about just making those dots, building them up. You can thin the dots out to get a lighter shading, or you can build them up to get that darker one. Overlapping will get that darker value. And again, you can spread it out to get that lighter value. The last way to shade is blending. And so blending is really all about smearing it, I guess. Using that stump is a great way to do that blending. So let's say I've got some marks here, some hatching that I've started. I can take that stump and start blending it. And that's another way to kind of fill in, do that shading. If I want it darker, I can always layer up, smear it, smudge it. And thinning it out just kind of moves it away from that. So you can get those different values with the blending. Now, value is also known as tone, right? Our value scale talks about the lightness and the darkness of our pigment, right, that we're using here. It helps us kind of build that 3D form, right? And kind of shows where that light and that shadow are. And so we can see kind of here with this sphere shape that the light is coming in this direction here. We have that lightest tone as our highlight. And then the further away that shape gets from the light, the darker it gets. So that lightest tone is that highlight. That's where the light is hitting. And that darkest tone is that shadow that's hidden from the light. And the way we show that is by using this value scale. Now, there are a few ways to create a value scale, right? One is by varying the pressure we use with our pencil. By pressing softer, a lighter touch, we get that lighter value. By pressing harder on our pencil, we get that darker value. Another way to do that is by using a variety of pencils. Last week we talked about how like the bees have more graphite in them, so they're going to be those darker colors. The B's are bolder in their colors, so they're going to give us that darker value. The H's are harder. They have less graphite in them, so they're going to give us our lighter tones, right? So using a variety of pencils is another way to get that value scale. So let's go ahead, let's spend a few moments creating a value scale for us, because we're going to use that, we're going to reference back to that as we go through our process today. Right? Now the value scale, there's a whole bunch of different values. That is limitless when it comes to values. Right here, I only have about 5 on there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of paper. If you have a clean piece of paper, go ahead and pull that out. And again, you can use regular sketch paper or copy paper. Any paper will work for today. And let's go ahead and just kind of draw a little square, a rectangle here. And we'll separate it into 5 spaces. And we're going to create our value scale today. And so remember, one of the things I said, to get the lightest tone, right, that lightest value, we can press lightly with our pencil, or we can get one of those H's. That H is going to give us that lighter touch. So I have, like, if I'm using one pencil, I'm just going to very lightly color that in. That's going to be my lightest tone. Now, if I'm using an H, then I'll probably use like a 2H to start. And so that's kind of my lightest tone there, right? So if I'm using different pencils. Okay? Now I'm going to skip all the way over to my darkest color here. Now, if I'm using one pencil, that's where I'm going to press the hardest, right? I'm going to put a lot of pressure on that pencil and create that dark value. If I'm using a variety of pencils, I'll get something like my 6B, and that's going to give me that darkest look. We can see. Okay. And so again, looking at these two values, that lightest value is going to be that highlight, and that darkest value is going to be that shadow that's hidden from the light. So these are the two really important values that we're looking at today. Next, we'll go to the middle, right? Our mid-tone. Now, the mid-tone is kind of what's here, right? It's that middle light. And so if I'm using one pencil, I'm just going to kind of lightly press. I'm going to press harder than that light tone, but softer than the darkest tone. And just kind of color that in. Now, if I'm using a variety of pencils, I'm going to do probably a 2B. That's a good mid-tone. And so I'll just kind of push that in there. So again, if I'm doing my lightest value, that's going to be, I have a 2H. My darkest value, I have a 6B. And my mid-tone here, I have about a 2B. And these are like good starting places. So now our in-between tones here, between the lightest and the mid-tone, if I'm using one pencil, I'm going to try and get a color, right, a value that's in between those. So sometimes that means doing a light tone and then going back again to make it slightly darker, right? So we can see that kind of change between the three. Now, if I'm using a variety of pencils, a B is usually a really good one to use here. And I can just kind of add that in. And so hopefully you can see, as we're building this scale up, those slight changes, right? And now for our last space, we want to get a value that's in between that mid-tone and that dark tone, like the darkest tone. So if I'm using one pencil, I'm going to press harder, but not as hard as that darkest tone. I still want that in-between value. And if I'm using a variety of pencils, a 4B is a good one to use here. We have this kind of value scale set up. And like I said, this is really helpful when it comes to building that form. It helps us define that form because it shows us where the light is hitting and where that darkest tone is. Without the value scale, without these different values on there, it won't look 3D, it'll look 2D, it'll just be that circle. And so this value scale is a really great starting place for us. So let's go ahead. We're going to start off by creating a sphere and using that value scale to kind of set that up for us. So one of the things that I always talk about when it comes to drawing and painting too, is that one of the ways we learn is by copying the masters, right? Throughout history, that's how we've learned, right? That's how artists have learned. That's how like they used to learn medicine, like all these different skills you learn by copying the masters, by apprenticing yourself, right? And so there's nothing wrong with tracing. There's nothing wrong with copying. There's nothing wrong with using those reference photos because that's how we learn, right? The important thing though is giving credit where credit is due. And so what we're going to be doing today by creating the sphere is we're going to be pulling from Mark Kessler. He's an excellent teacher, drawing teacher. He's got several books out, and I think he's got several used to have several programs on like PBS. But one of the things that I've always liked about his work is, and I can show it here, is what he does kind of in the first few sections where he talks about creating that sphere and cube. The way he kind of sets it up is really simplified, and it makes it easy to understand. And so we're going to kind of be pulling from his work today to kind of create that sphere shape, right? So let's go ahead and start off. If you have your paper handy, we're going to start off by creating that circle. So this is that basic shape, right? That 2D shape. And to create, like I said, and to create that 3D shape, we're going to add that value scale. We're going to add that value scale to kind of show where the light is and where that shadow is. So when it comes to drawing, it's incredibly vital to pay attention to where that light is, right? That's going to show us where to put that lightest tone and where to put that darkest tone, right? So if I'm going to show here with a little light, I have a sphere shape and I have a light here. So if my light is hitting the sphere, you see the lightest point here is right where that light is hitting. And that darkest tone is right under here that's missing that light. So when we create our sphere, when we start drawing it on our paper, we're going to kind of start from this lightest point and work our way out to the darkest point, right? Varying those tones. One of the things that I want to point out too is when it comes to the shadow, and this is that shadow here, what's cast by the light, the shade is what is blocked by the light. That's going to be this backside of our sphere, but that shadow is what's cast by the light. And that shadow changes depending on where our light is coming from. But the one thing I want to kind of point out with that shadow is that it's not an endless shadow. It has an end, right? And it's because that's where the light is. We see that darkest point of the shadow here, and we can see it gradually getting lighter the further out it goes, right? And then there's like an ending point, and that's where that light hits. And so we're going to kind of think about that today as we're making that sphere, noticing where that light hits, and then building those darker tones up till we get to the shadow. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and start by creating that circle. And for the purpose of today, for the drawing today, I'm going to make my sun, my light, come from here. And so that's going to help me kind of set up. Once I find where that light is, that lets me know where to put all these different values. And so what we're doing today, we're going to start with that lightest tone, right? And create where that light is hitting, which that light is hitting right here. Okay, this is that highlight part. And so that's going to be our lightest tone. And if that's our lightest tone, and if the sun is hitting, that light is hitting here, that means that darkest tone is going to be right here, right? And so it's going to gradually get darker the further away from the light we go. Okay? So if you are using one pencil, you want your lightest tone to be here. And we can think back to how we were building up the marks last week with the scribble, the hatching, the cross hatching, those mark makings. We're going to utilize those today. So whichever one feels most comfortable to you, use that one for sure. I tend to stick with like a mix of scribble and hatching. So like I said, whichever one feels most comfortable. But we're going to start with that lightest tone, right? And then gradually get darker the further outside of the light we go. And so that mid-tone right here, this middle one, that's what's going to be kind of our next color, right? And again, that light, if we pay attention to where that light is hitting, it's going to kind of circle out a little bit, right? So that mid-tone is going to go right here. The highlight is here, and we're getting gradually darker as we're coming. We're going to get to those darker colors here. We're going to go to that mid dark tone, and that's going to be kind of here. And so we're gradually getting darker and darker as we're getting further and further away from that light, right? That light source. And definitely follow along. I know when it comes to drawing, I am not a big fan of homework, but I will say that drawing is a practice that needs to be nurtured. So the more we do it, the more confident we'll feel in that mark making. So it's okay if your drawing right now doesn't look the same as mine. That's totally okay. It doesn't have to look this way. This is just us kind of practicing and feeling it out, right? And so again, we have that lightest tone here. That's our highlight. That's where the light is hitting the most. And as we go around this sphere, we're getting darker and darker. Now that darkest tone that we have is going to be right underneath. It's going to be the part that's furthest away from that light. And so this is where that darkest tone is going to be. Right. And because that light is like above and not completely beside, but it's above, it's going to gradually get lighter too, the further out we go. Just kind of a backwards of what we just did with that sphere. And so we can see kind of where that light is hitting, right? It getting darker. And then where that shadow is, starting to get lighter. And this is kind of a really important part when it comes to drawing. Even if you're drawing something that's made up, completely imaginary, the first step is always to think about where that light is hitting, because that's going to help you create that form. So let's say I'm doing another circle. I've got a circle here. So that light is going to look different than this one from the side, right? If I'm doing it this direction, that means that lightest point is here. And that lightest tone, that darkest tone is going to be here, right? And so still doing that lightest tone, that lightest value, and gradually getting darker the further down, the further away we get from that light, right? So with that highlight, and then with that mid-tone, gradually getting darker, and then that mid-dark tone. And then that darkest tone here, that's gradually getting lighter the further away it gets from that in that shadow. So that highlight, that mid-tone, that mid-dark tone, this one, and then that shadow is that darkest tone that's kind of changing. Again, you know, if we do that sphere here, it's going to be that same thing, focusing on where that light is hitting. That's that highlight. And then where that shadow, that darkest point is, right? And we build it the same way, gradually getting darker the further away from the light we go. And then when we're in the shadow, we're gradually getting lighter the more we get back into that light. And of course, these are rough sketches. These are just illustrations, so we can kind of see where that highlight, that mid-tone, the mid-darker tone, and then getting darker in our shadow. So I'm going to go ahead and change my paper. But if you still have space on your paper, definitely stay on that same page. But we're going to talk about cubes for a second. When it comes to cubes, it's a little different than doing that sphere. We have more planes that we're having to work with here. And so one of the things that we have to kind of pay attention to is this word foreshortening when we do a cube. And foreshortening, if we look at our definitions, that foreshortening is like the distortion, like distorting it or squishing it. That's a technical term right there, squishing it, to make one side appear closer than the other. Right. And so foreshortening is important when it comes to creating volume because it's another way to kind of get depth. Right. So using that foreshortening with our value scale will give us that 3D form that we're looking for with a cube. Right. And so that basic shape that we're starting with, that basic shape is that square. That's our 2D shape. Right. To get 3D, we're going to have to do a little foreshortening, right? To kind of give it that form. So this is what we're going to kind of take a look at today, right? Now, foreshortening, like I said, is kind of squishing it. We know, right, that the shape itself is not changing, right? So if I'm using this box here, if I'm making it foreshortened, I know that these sides here our, like this is our square, right? But when I do it to make it foreshortening, it looks like it's squished, even though that shape itself hasn't changed. And so what we're going to talk about is how to get that foreshortened space, right? For our square, how to make it look like it's still the same size, like it's still that square. It just looks like we're looking at an angle. And so with the light, you can see my light is hitting here. This is that lightest part, right? And so that darkest part is going to be blocked by that light, right? So if we're doing that, maybe it's this way, this shape. So I've got this point that's closest to me. This is that closest point. You can see that darker tone here, and it gradually gets lighter. One of the things, I don't know if it's going to be maybe a little difficult to see. Here we go. You can see the light is hitting that top, and you can see the different tones on the sides of the box, right? And so one way to do that, and this is one of the things that I really appreciate about Mark Kistler, the way he describes or walks you through how to make that foreshortened square, right? And so to make that foreshortened square, that first space we're going to start with, that first plane, is this top plane here, right? And so what we're going to do, one of the ways that I found is probably the easiest way to do this is to kind of think in dots, right? With dots. And so I'm going to start off with my finger. And this is a really good, like I said, a good starting place so we can kind of understand foreshortening. And we don't have to do it every time. But again, it's a good starting place. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a dot and put it on the top of my finger, and a dot and put it on the bottom of my finger. And so when I move my finger, I have these two dots on top of each other. I'm going to go to the side and add another dot, and go to the side and add another dot. So it looks kind of like this almost diamond shape. Okay. And so when I connect the dots, it looks like that foreshortened square, right? It's taking that 2D shape and squishing it, distorting it. So it looks like the top of a box, right? Now, if we look at our definitions from earlier, one of the words is placement. Placement talks about when something is lower on the page, it appears closer. If something is bigger on the page, it appears closer. The smaller it looks, the shorter it looks, the further back it looks. And so if we're seeing this as the top of our box, we want that closest point here to be the longest. So I'm going to make kind of a long mark here. Now, because these 2 points are the corners that are further away, they're going to be slightly shorter, right? And so I'm just going to kind of draw those down, right? Again, this one, because this corner is closest to me, I'm making it slightly larger, slightly longer. And then these sides slightly smaller, shorter. So when I connect those two, I've now built this cube, right? And because this is longer, right? Because this is further down the page, closer, it appears closer. Because these are shorter, they appear further back, right? And so this is kind of an easy way to start setting up that cube, right? And so just the same with the sphere, when it comes to finding the light, let's say for the drawing, this is where my light is. And so just the same way, if we're drawing where that light is hitting, right? Where that light is hitting, we're going to pay attention to not only the shadow, which is what's cast by the light, but also the shading that's on that's blocked by the light, right? And so what we talked about, that darkest value is going to be that shadow. That's going to be right here again. And where the light is hitting is right here. Right? So this is going to be that lightest tone, right? This is going to be that darkest tone. And here's going to be that kind of mid-dark tone, right? Our mid-tone is going to be kind of here, right? So we've got that lightest tone, that highlight is where that light is hitting the strongest, right? That mid-tone gets a little light but it's further away. That mid-dark tone is blocked by the light. And then that darkest tone is that shadow. And so that's where that darkest value is going to be. And just like with that sphere, it's going to get lighter the further out it goes because the light is going to start hitting it. So we're kind of building that up. And it's okay if it doesn't work doing these dots. It's totally okay. It's just like it's kind of a nice starting place to kind of help us see how to foreshorten it. It doesn't have to be that way. Some people can just do it by looking. And hopefully the more we practice this, the more we'll be able to do that foreshortened space. And I want to encourage us, like I said, I'm not a big fan of homework, but I want to encourage you, if you have time, to kind of play around with that during the week. Maybe drawing some spheres and some cubes, maybe noticing just the light. Maybe it's not about drawing it, but just noticing it around you, where the light is hitting. If you have a glass of water on the table, where that shadow is starting to show up. Observation is huge when it comes to drawing. It's incredibly important. And finding that light, observing where that light is vital when it comes to creating that volume. So one last thing I want to talk about with the cube before we move on to line. Sometimes we can get to where like maybe it's not just one box, but maybe it's a stack of 3 boxes. How does shadow work that way when you start building different shapes, right? And so I'm going to come over here. I'm still going to use my light source here. And I'm going to start off by drawing a cube. I'm going to set it up kind of the same way that I just did, doing that foreshortening square. And of course, you're welcome to follow along with me if you like. But I'm starting off building that box. And then because this corner is closest to me, this one's going to be the longest one. And because these corners are further away, I'm going to make them slightly shorter so they appear further away, and then connect those lines. Now, if I'm building that box on top of another box, let's say, what I'm going to do, well, let's say we'll put a box on top of this one. So this is my bottom box. If I'm building a box on top of it, I'm going to do kind of that same thing. I'm going to make it slightly smaller here. And so I'm just going to kind of build those as well. That same thing, I'm building it on top. And I'm just going to kind of build that foreshortened square, come down a little bit. I made them too small. So building him up, sorry. We're going to make him smaller. This top box a little smaller. So when we draw it down, we're still doing that same thing, right? Building that closer line, that corner that's closest to us, we're making it longer. Those corners that are further away, we're making them a little shorter. And so we're resting it on the top of our box here. So what we have is this top box that I just drew. On top of another box. Okay. And so when it comes to the light, our light is here, right? And so that means that that darkest point, right? That darkest value, that darkest tone is going to be blocked by the light. So it's going to be here and here. So when we're doing those two boxes, right, that's the part that's blocked. And again, the further away it gets from that box, the lighter it's going to go. But that's our darkest tone. And still, again, that highlight is going to be here, and that highlight is going to be here. on this shape here. Right? And that mid-tone, just like here, that mid-tone is going to be facing away. It's that shading. Right? And then that mid-tone, like lighter tone, is going to be right here. So we can see where that light is hitting. We can see those darker tones, and we can see that highlight. And so it's helpful. Like, I'm not saying you have to create this value scale every time you sit down to draw, but I think starting off here, thinking about where the light is hitting when it comes to those 3D shapes, that sphere, that cube, having this to kind of reference kind of gets us in that habit of thinking about that lightest tone and that darkest tone. If any questions come up, again, always feel free to email us at our Contact That Matter email, or message us on our Facebook page. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. We'll see you soon.